That they would, of course, all be funded in the main by his sponsorship.
Obviously, at that point, things were getting a little bit out of hand, and he must have, at that point, been trying to figure out how he was going to pull it off.
Brian had told probably one too many lies to Amal. He then had to find a way of making that happen.
I think this goes to the development of his fantasy life, and what is interesting about him is it seems to be a pretty rapid escalation in terms of his fantasies. He's getting more and more detached from the reality of his life and true situation, and so that within a relatively short time he's into a situation where he's going to do anything he can to avoid detection, people finding out what he's doing, but of course his parents see through it very easily because he's totally dependent on them.
Brian Blackwell desperately needed money to fund the luxury trip he'd promised Amal, but his parents were about to put a stop to his extravagant spending. On Sunday, July the 25th, 2004, things were about to come to a head between Brian and his parents. It began with a trip Brian and his father made to the tennis club that afternoon.
A number of witnesses who were present that Sunday afternoon, those witnesses are probably the last persons ever to see Brian Blackwell Sr. alive again. Records demonstrate that sometime after 11 o'clock on that Sunday morning, he booked 2 tickets from Manchester to New York, to JFK Airport. Those tickets were for himself and Amal. They were particularly expensive tickets. I think they were business class. Certainly the cost of those was between £4,000 and £5,000, a sum of money that Brian Blackwell simply did not have access to, but a sum of money that could easily be met on his father's credit card. And in fact, that was how those flights were paid for.
His parents find out about it, and they find out that Brian's promised this holiday to Amal and put the foot down and say that he's not going to go. Now, this is a great challenge to Brian, because up until this point, everything that Brian's been able to say to Amal, he's been able to deliver on. He said, "I'll buy you a car," and he bought her a car. It arrived on the doorstep. He said he'd buy Amal a diamond ring, and she got a ring even though it wasn't diamond. So all the fantasies that Brian had lived out up until this point hadn't been challenged. When we're left in a situation where his parents challenge his authority or his ability to go to America, how's he going to get out of the situation? There's a great loss of face or a loss of self-esteem. He's embarrassed.
It's very difficult to be accurate as to precisely what took place that fateful early evening, because the only person still alive who can tell us what happened is Brian Blackwell, and he is such a practiced liar and deceiver that very little store can be set by what he said. I suspect probably what must have happened is that he reached the point of no return with his parents. They were onto his spending. They'd clearly been roused in the past about his spending, and Brian must have been pushed into a corner in his own mind, and at that stage matters took the most dreadful turn. Thereafter, it's obvious that there was a row between Brian and his parents.
Brian Blackwell hit his 71-year-old father over the head with a claw hammer and stabbed him 30 times with a 10-inch carving knife. He then knocked his 61-year-old mother unconscious with the hammer before stabbing her in the head and chest around 20 times.
Having killed his parents, Brian later described burning the clothing that he'd been wearing in an incinerator in the garden. Amal was waiting for him to turn up at the house and had actually rung him on a couple of occasions, and a taxi had called outside the long driveway, which he hadn't come out to, so she then arranged for another taxi, and he left.
In fact, at one point, he pretended to go back into the house to say goodbye, in the full knowledge that he'd left the body of his parents there. He then went to Amal's house, and it was noticeable that in the course of the journey from Melling to Amal's house, the taxi driver didn't detect any signs of the traumatic event to which Brian had recently been involved. In fact, he said it was a perfectly normal conversation, which is a rather surprising feature and a rather chilling feature.
The following day, they flew to New York. They flew business class for tickets just under £5,000. They stayed at one of the better hotels in New York. and then flew on to Miami and Barbados and had a very expensive holiday. It was clear now that money was no object to Brian. It seems almost beyond belief that any person, particularly a person who is only fairly young and not that worldly wise, could put aside the events that he'd left back at home, which were horrific, and be able to separate them from his holiday. It takes a certain sort of person, I think, that is able to do that. And it was certainly something he was able to achieve, to the extent that Amal had no idea whatsoever that he was carrying this, what anybody else would describe as a huge burden on himself.
When Brian Blackwell and Amal Saba landed in New York, Brian had arranged for a limousine to meet them and take them to one of the city's most luxurious hotels, the Plaza. He'd booked one of its top suites overlooking Central Park. All the time, Amal was completely unaware of the horrific crime Brian had committed. In this chilling video clip, Brian is clearly seen to be having a great time with Amal, enjoying the luxury surroundings just days after killing his parents.
Let's show you the bathroom with our own little television, shower,
And jacuzzi.
and we have our own little dressing table. That's me, hello.
And that's me.
And this is our view at night. Don't know if you can see anything.
Here she was in this, it's like an apartment. It's the presidential suite. It's where Kennedy stays and Bush stays. And Brian then ordered a meal of lobster and oysters and caviar. So it must have been very romantic. And he said that she could go to Prada or Gucci or wherever she wanted in Fifth Avenue in the morning and buy whatever she wanted.
They stayed in very top hotels, hundreds of pounds a night. They ate and drank lavishly, the finest champagne, lobsters. We actually recovered a bill from one of the hotels. It was an extremely expensive dinner. There was absolutely no expense spared on this trip. And certainly Amal must have been dazzled by the ability that this young man had to spend money.
It's a curious feature that she didn't seem to be concerned that there was no tennis, but it may well have been that, in fact, that was another lie told by Brian.
They toured North America, going in no particular order to San Francisco, Miami, and to Barbados. The pretext of the trip, of course, was that Brian would be playing a tennis tournament in Miami, but he had to tell Amal that he couldn't play because the weather didn't suit it, and that's why the tournament was cancelled.
They enjoyed a very, very good lifestyle. A lifestyle, no doubt, in keeping with the vision that Brian had of himself as an international tennis player. At no stage did Amal have any clue that there was anything wrong with Brian's parents. On occasions, he pretended to get in touch with his parents. We've been able to recover the photographs that they took of the trip, and viewing those photographs, they're happy, they're smiling in all the various locations, and freed from perhaps the constraints of his parents. He made full use of it, he made full use of the cards, and he spent a vast amount of money in the course of those 2 weeks or so.
She said that there was never at any point any sense that he was under stress, distressed, nervous, anxious. So they had a whistle-stop tour of the high spots of America with no indication whatsoever of what he'd left behind, of the horror that he'd left behind.
Teenager Brian Blackwell has just enjoyed a £30,000 holiday of a lifetime to America with girlfriend Amal Saba. He'd used his dead parents' credit cards to pay for the trip, after killing them and leaving their bodies to rot at their home in Melling, Liverpool. With his unsuspecting girlfriend, Brian returns to the scene of the killings.
When Brian came back from America, he went straight back to his home. I personally think at this point he expected to see police activity around the house.
They were met by a neighbour who expressed some surprise that they didn't know Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell had gone to Spain. At that stage, it presented Brian with another opportunity to lie his way out of difficulty.
I went in that particular morning to pick the letters up, and I noticed his girlfriend was in front of the bungalow, and there was luggage on the floor. And I was amazed. I thought, oh, well, perhaps they've all come back. And I said, is Brian's mother and father back? And she said, we haven't been with them. She said, we've been separate. We've been to New York and they've gone to Spain. And then she shouted to Brian. He said, there's a neighbour here. Then he came back. He came from the side of the bungalow and he said, oh, hello, Gordon, you know. And I said, oh, hello, Brian. He said, I've just come to pick your letters up. He said, oh. And I mentioned their mother and father, and he said they hadn't come back. And he couldn't get in the bungalow, he said, because he hadn't got a key.
He recovered the car from a garage, and he was invited to stay with Amal, which of course would have been fitted in, I think, with what he hoped she would ask him to do.
Brian did keep going back to the house, and sometimes he went with her, and she recalls him playing tennis against the back wall. She recalls him going into his father's stash of wine to bring some out to give to her mother as a thank you for having him. And he was behaving in basically a completely ordinary way. Later on, what we did find, and quite unbelievably, was that Brian, in actual fact, had gone back and gone into the house himself. This was several weeks now after the bodies had been left there, and there was a great deal of decomposition of the bodies, and it was a fairly horrific scene. But Brian had gone back to the house and recovered certain photographs that he wanted, and also some posts that he felt that he would need. So he'd actually been into the house while the bodies were there in a very poor state.
He ignored their presence. He was unable to look at either his mum and dad, and he took some family mementos together with the hammer which had been used to strike his father, which peculiarly he kept.
Brian Blackwell carried on as if nothing had happened. On August the 19th, 2004, more than 3 weeks after the killings, he picked up his long-awaited exam results.
On A-level day, when Brian came in to pick up his A-levels, he was very much like many of the other students who were there on that day. Seemed to be happy and excited by the results that he'd received. He'd achieved straight A grades, so obviously he was going on to where he hoped to go to. And when I spoke to him, he seemed to be normally happy, rather like the rest of the students on the day.
Indeed, rather cruelly, when the day came for him to receive his A-level results, he complained that his parents had in some way let him down by not being there for when the results came. And of course only Brian knew that his parents were in no position to join in his success on that day. Brian had a problem because he knew that the bodies of his parents still lay in the house undetected, and the longer that went on, the greater the problem was going to be. And at one stage he actually went into Kirby, which is quite close to his parents' property, and he approached two young men, offered them money to burn the house down. Again, he must have thought in his own mind that that was a perfectly proper thing to do. It was a way of getting rid of the problem. But so arrogant was he that he never gave any thought to the rather curious figure he would cut on the streets of Kirby. He stood out straight away from the way he was dressed, the way he spoke, as not being a local. And in fact, the two lads that he spoke to, one of them thought he was an undercover police officer. He told them that he wanted a house burnt down. He told them that the house belonged to a drug dealer, and he'd had difficulties with the drug dealer, and he wanted revenge. At no stage did either of those two lads believe there was any truth whatsoever in the deal that Brian was putting to them.
Thinking the Blackwells were on holiday at their villa in Spain, neighbour Pete Boyle became concerned at the build-up of mail in the front porch, which had been left open. He decided to go to his neighbour's house and post the mail through the letterbox.
And it was only then when I picked up the mail and I lifted the flap up, which was obviously an airtight flap, and the smell came out. And it was when I stepped back and I looked at the door, and it was strange really, because we hadn't, neither my daughter or I We hadn't noticed it when we were walking up,